On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going old school. We're making corn cob wine.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from meat to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
Corn cob wine is a thing that I've been wanting to make for over a decade, but it's not often easy to accumulate a ton of spare corn cobs. Fortunately, the Great Mead Project, which we wrapped up a few months ago, afforded me the opportunity to collect a whole bunch of corn cobs, 17 pounds of corn cobs, in fact, to make this project possible. And I wanted to keep the recipe as close to the old school methods as I could. Now, it's not easy to find information out there about these old recipes that date back to the Depression era and before, but I was able to find some recipes from magazines, periodicals, and even books that date back to kind of the 50s through the 70s. So this recipe borrows from those recipes, kind of figuring out what's common from recipe to recipe and then putting a slightly modern twist on it. So you will see some powdered wine tannin used here for tannin, but for the most part we kept things original. Now those old recipes use things like raisins or black tea in order to introduce some tannins, and I think those are perfectly okay choices for something like this. However, if you wanted to be, really rustic, you could use something like dandelion root or chicory. I think both of those could be really fun. But again, powdered wine tannin is what we used here. For fermentable sugars, not much comes from the corn cobs, so we introduce a lot of corn sugar to bring up the ABV here. However, you're going to see us use alpha amylase, an enzyme that is going to turn some of the starches in those cobs into fermentable sugars for us. Now, it's not much, but I wanted to eke out as much as I could from these cobs. So, let's take a look at our recipe. The ingredients for this corn cob wine are 17 pounds of corn cobs, 8 pounds of corn sugar, amylase enzyme, pectic enzyme, and water up to about 5 gallons. We used Lutra kveik yeast to ferment. In secondary, I balanced with 3 ounces of lemon juice and 6 grams of wine tannin. I also back sweetened with 4.5 ounces of sucrose. This corn cob wine begins with a whole heckin' lot of corn cobs. And under usual circumstances, this would seem like a lot of corn cobs to just have on hand in your freezer, but fortunately these came from another project on the channel. So I had plenty of corn cobs to play with in this recipe. With my corn cobs in the brew kettle, I poured some hot water over the top of them, and then moved that up to the stove. And we're gonna boil these for a little bit over 3.5 hours. I checked on them here and there and made sure to stir, just to make sure all the corn cobs were getting mixed around in the liquid. And I did that intermittently throughout the boil. After those were done boiling, I put them into my mash tun. This is an insulated cooler that has been converted with a false bottom, so you can keep stuff at a high temperature for a long time. Usually this would be done for grains, like for making a beer, but for this recipe, we're using it for our corn cobs. A mash tun is probably not necessary for this winemaking process. However, I had one on hand because I do beer brewing at home, and it provided me more leniency because of all that insulation in keeping the temperature at kind of a consistent heat throughout, rather than doing this in the kettle where I might have to kick up the gas every now and then and heat it back up. I think you could do this in the kettle just fine. You just need to kind of keep an eye on what the temperature in that kettle is in order to make sure that you're mashing your corn cobs at a consistent temperature. Alpha amylase enzyme, the enzyme we're using here, the optimal temperature range for conversion is about the mid 150s Fahrenheit to mid 160s Fahrenheit. And so you're trying to keep the liquid in there about that temperature so the enzyme can do its work. The mash tun just made this a lot easier for me, not having to babysit it overnight. I poured in a little bit of cold water to bring the temperature down some. And when I had that at 157 degrees Fahrenheit, I added some amylase enzyme. Amylase is an enzyme that helps break down certain starches and convert them into fermentable sugars. I didn't know how much of those type of starches would be in the corn cobs or the liquid, but I wanted to go ahead and add that in just to cover all of my bases with this recipe. So again, this is alpha amylase enzyme, and it's a powdered version of an enzyme that's found in malts like 2-row and 6-row that you would use in beer. And those malts carrying that enzyme convert starches into sugars to make the beer wort fermentable. Here we're adding some because I'm hoping that there are starches in those corn cobs that can be converted into fermentable sugars using this enzyme. And I can't vouch for it. I have no idea how much conversion we got. You'll see that our gravity was pretty low before we added the corn sugar to this, but it's a step that I wanted to take just to ensure I was getting as much as I could out of the corn cobs, because this is a big experiment, so why not do the most? I let that sit overnight and through the next day because I really wanted the amylase enzyme to be able to do some work in there, and I wanted the temperature to come down to a kind of reasonable temperature for transfer. Then I transferred it off into a carboy. I checked the gravity with my refractometer and it was incredibly low. But fortunately, I had 8 pounds of corn sugar on hand that I could add to bring up the gravity to a more reasonable level. Then after mixing it all up, I checked it with the refractometer again, and 1.085 makes a whole lot more sense for this project. I used a slurry of Lutra kveik yeast. This was yeast that had been saved from a previous batch. Check out our video on yeast washing if you haven't seen that yet. This recipe is a great reminder that yeast selection is incredibly important. Yeast is not just yeast, and we wanted to select a yeast for this that accentuated the corny flavors, and so that's why we used Lutra kveik. Lutra has a relatively moderate ABV tolerance, definitely higher than what we did here, and so that's why we were able to get this to ferment out completely dry. Lutra also maintains flavors really well. It's a nice clean fermenter, and it flocculates really well, meaning it drops out to the bottom of your fermenter, forms a nice hard yeast cake, so that makes it easier to get a clean rack once it goes clear. Another thing that I love about Lutra is it washes really well, and you can use a Lutra colony over and over and over again, and it seems to just be a powerhouse every time. Other yeasts that might be a good choice for this project are K1V 1116 or maybe even Cote de Blanc, something that's just kind of a nice, clean, but bright white wine yeast. I also hit that with pectic enzyme to help clear up any of the pectin haze that might be in there. Then I put an airlock on it. The next day, I added 12 grams of fermentable for yeast nutrient. I'm sure there's lots of nitrogen in there from boiling the corn cobs, but I didn't want to skimp on nutrient. That nutrient was just front-loaded like you would do with most country fruit wines, just to give the yeast a little added boost. Shake, shake, shake. And a few weeks later, it was done fermenting. This took somewhere around 4 weeks to finish fermenting. So I transferred that off into a secondary vessel. After it had sat for a while, I could tell that it needed some amendment. So I added a little bit of powdered wine tannin to give it a little bit of grip on the mouth and a little bit of astringency. And I also added that lemon juice just to give it a little bit of freshness and just a touch of acidity that kind of enhanced the corn flavor in there. I found this was just enough balancing, so after stabilizing it with potassium metabisulfite and potassium sorbate, I decided to go ahead and back sweeten and bottle. I used about 1 ounce per gallon, so that was 4.5 ounces of cane sugar. And I mixed that with equal parts water to make a simple syrup. That simple syrup went in during racking, so that mixed throughout the batch, so every bottle would have the same amount of sweetness. And then with a nice, clean, crystal clear racking, I went into bottling. This made about 2 dozen bottles of corn cob wine. Ta-da! A A few days ago, my friend Camila joined me on a live stream where we actually opened a bottle of the corn cob wine. I'll cut to her thoughts on this while I get this bottle open.
Ooh. It definitely tastes like corn.
Yeah.
It's like I'm drinking corn. You know when you like cook corn and then like it's in your plate and then you eat the rice and there's like a leftover liquidy corn part. This is what this is. But
Well, yeah, essentially that's what I brewed with. Corn
I
cobs.
cannot taste the lime though. Or the lemon.
You shouldn't. You shouldn't be able to taste it.
Really?
Because
I feel like it will go.
it just is in there just at a little bit of tartness. Just a little bit of acid, because it was kind of flat without just a little bit of acid in there.
The aftertaste is very, very corny. It's like I just ate actual corn in the cup.
Here we are, 6-ish months from yeast pitch, maybe 7 months from yeast pitch. My understanding is this is intended to be drank young. You can see it's got a nice straw color, very light colored wine. Very, very much like a nice white wine. You can smell corn on the nose. I think that's what's so interesting about this wine is, you know, you don't often get vegetable-based wines. And that's kind of, even if you can consider corn a vegetable, because, you know, it's basically just grass on steroids. But it's definitely got a smooth, buttery, kind of Chardonnay-like nose, but definitely with big pops of corn in there. Not to be confused with corn pops. That very light sweetening is really nice. It takes it just off of dry, just like slightly past dry, in a way that accentuates the corn flavors without making it a sweet wine. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of dandelion wine or dandelion mead. It's got some grassy, floral kind of characters in there that kind of play against that tannic, corn cobby kind of flavor. It's very difficult to describe. The first sip is slightly sweet, like when biting into a cob of sweet corn. But as it washes down, you start to pick up some of those notes of acidity and a little bit of that dryness that kind of gives an astringency to your tongue in a way that feels very much like a white wine, like a Vino Verde, actually, is what this reminds me of. But then as you exhale, you get those Chardonnay notes, those buttery, corny kind of notes. But again, just enough acid that it takes some of the edge off, or gives it an edge, I guess. It's very unusual. I'm excited to break out bottles of this summer for people who have no idea what they're about to drink and get their thoughts in a totally blind tasting, because honestly, based on this, I think corn cobs make a perfectly pleasant wine. And this is the type of thing I might serve with fish, you know? Little grilled fish in the summertime could be a great compliment. I hope you enjoyed this maybe unusual episode of Doing the Most, where I feel like we really did the most with corn cob wine. If you're into content like this, I would encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you already haven't and ring that notification bell. We have new content here on the channel every Friday. And of course, you can follow us on Instagram, join our Discord server, etc., etc. And I'm curious your thoughts. If you were going to do a big corn cob wine project like this, how would you execute it? And particularly, how would you make sure that even more corn flavor came through from the cobs? Throw your thoughts down in the comments. It feels like spring has finally sprung here in Oklahoma after a couple of big winter storms, and it feels like maybe the corn harvest might be on the horizon. So I hope you'll give this recipe, or any corn fermentation recipe, a try. Until next time, I hope you are well, happy brewing, and cheers.